The bullet whistled past Adelaide Klein's ear so close she felt the heat of it, and in that split second before her horse reared, she knew her father's enemies had finally found her. She hit the rocky ground hard, the wind knocked from her lungs as her mare bolted into the scrub pine. 3 riders emerged from the canyon walls, their faces hidden by bandanas, rifles raised. Adelaide scrambled behind a boulder, her hand instinctively reaching for the pistol at her hip, only to remember she'd left it in her saddlebag that morning. Stupid. Her father would have called it careless, and he would have been right. "Come on out, Miss Klein," one of them called, his voice muffled. "We just want to talk about your pa's claim." Talk. As if her father hadn't been murdered 3 months ago for that very claim, left bleeding in the mud outside their cabin while she was in Trinidad buying supplies. As if these men hadn't burned everything she owned to the ground, forcing her to live like an animal in these mountains. Another shot rang out, this one splintering rock near her head. Adelaide pressed herself flat, tasting copper and fear. She was 22 years old and about to die in the Colorado Territory mountains over a silver claim she didn't even want. Then the world exploded with sound. A rifle cracked from somewhere above, and one of the riders fell from his horse with a scream. The other 2 wheeled around, firing wildly at the ridge. Adelaide saw him then, a massive figure standing atop the rocks like something carved from the mountain itself. He worked the lever of his rifle with practiced efficiency, firing again. Another rider dropped. The 3rd man didn't wait. He spurred his horse and fled back through the canyon, leaving his companions where they fell. The silence that followed rang in Adelaide's ears. She stayed pressed against the boulder, her heart hammering against her ribs, watching as the figure descended from the ridge with surprising grace for his size. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with shoulders that seemed to span half the sky. Dark hair fell past his collar, and a thick beard covered his jaw. His clothes were buckskin and worn wool, and he moved with the quiet confidence of a man who belonged in this wilderness. He checked both fallen men quickly, his expression grim. Then he turned to Adelaide, and she saw his eyes were a startling pale blue, like winter ice. "You hurt?" His voice was deep, rough from disuse. Adelaide managed to shake her head, though her hands trembled as she pushed herself upright. "No. Thank you." He studied her for a long moment, taking in her dusty split skirt, the torn sleeve of her blouse, her sun-darkened face. "You're Klein's daughter." It wasn't a question. Adelaide tensed. "Did you know my father?" "Saw him in town a few times. Heard about what happened." He glanced at the dead men. "Suspected his claim would draw more trouble. These are Garrett's men." James Garrett. The name made Adelaide's stomach twist with hatred. He owned half the mining operations around Trinidad, and he'd wanted her father's claim for years. Now he wanted her gone so he could take it without witnesses. "I have nothing left," she said, her voice harder than she intended. "He burned my cabin, took everything. I've been living in a cave for 2 months." Something shifted in those pale eyes. Not pity exactly, but something close to understanding. He shouldered his rifle and held out a hand. "Name's Thomas Young. Most folks call me the Mountain Man when they bother to call me anything. Got a place about 5 miles north. You can stay there tonight at least." Adelaide stared at his outstretched hand. It was broad and calloused, scarred from years of hard living. She'd been alone for so long, trusting no one, that the offer felt almost foreign. But night was coming, and she had no horse, no supplies, and no shelter. She took his hand. His grip was firm but careful, as though he was conscious of his own strength. He pulled her to her feet easily, and she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. "Adelaide," she said. "Adelaide Klein." He nodded once, then whistled sharply. A massive buckskin horse emerged from the trees, followed by Adelaide's mare, which Thomas must have caught. He helped her mount her horse with the same careful strength, then swung onto his own mount with easy grace. They rode in silence through the deepening twilight. Adelaide studied him from the corner of her eye. Thomas Young was built like the mountains themselves, all muscle and solid strength. His hands on the reins were steady, his posture relaxed but alert. He moved like a man who'd spent his entire life in these wild places, reading the land the way other men read books. "How long have you been up here?" Adelaide asked finally, unable to bear the quiet any longer. 10 years, give or take. Came out after the war." He didn't elaborate on which side he'd fought for, and Adelaide didn't ask. The war had been over for 15 years now, and most men preferred to leave those memories buried. Do you ever go to town? Few times a year, for supplies. His tone suggested he didn't much care for civilization. Adelaide fell silent again. She understood that preference now. Trinidad had offered her nothing but empty sympathy after her father's death. The sheriff had shrugged and said he couldn't prove anything. The townsfolk had whispered and avoided her eyes. No one wanted to cross James Garrett. Thomas's cabin appeared as full darkness fell. It was larger than Adelaide expected, built of sturdy logs with a stone chimney and a covered porch. Outbuildings stood nearby, including what looked like a stable and a smokehouse. Everything was neat and well maintained, which surprised her. She'd expected something more rough, more temporary. "You built all this yourself?" she asked as he helped her dismount. "Most of it. Had help with the barn a few years back." He led the horses to the stable, and Adelaide followed, watching as he unsaddled both animals with efficient movements. "You can sleep in the cabin. I'll take the barn." "You don't have to do that. This is your home." He glanced at her, and something in his expression made her breath catch. "Wouldn't be right. You've been through enough." The simple kindness in those words nearly undid her. Adelaide had been holding herself together through sheer stubbornness for months, but suddenly her throat was tight and her eyes burned. She turned away quickly, pretending to examine the stable. Thomas didn't comment on her reaction. He just finished with the horses, then led her to the cabin. Inside was clean and spare, with a stone fireplace, a sturdy table, 2 chairs, and a bed in the corner. Furs covered the floor, and dried herbs hung from the rafters. Books lined a shelf near the fireplace, which surprised her again. "There's stew in the pot," Thomas said, stirring the coals in the fireplace. "Help yourself. I'll bring in more wood." He left before Adelaide could thank him again. She stood in the center of the cabin, suddenly overwhelmed by the simple comfort of 4 walls and a roof. She couldn't remember the last time she'd felt safe. The stew was venison and wild onions, rich and filling. Adelaide ate standing by the fire, too hungry for manners. When Thomas returned with an armload of wood, she'd already finished 2 bowls. "When did you last eat?" he asked, stacking the logs neatly beside the hearth. Adelaide had to think about it. "Yesterday morning, maybe." His jaw tightened, but he just ladled himself a bowl and settled into one of the chairs. Adelaide took the other, and they ate in comfortable silence. She found herself studying him again in the firelight. His face was weathered and hard, but not cruel. There were scars on his hands and one along his jaw. He ate with the same efficient economy he did everything else, no wasted motion. "Those men will come back," she said finally. "Garrett won't stop until he has that claim. I should leave tomorrow, head to Denver maybe, get away from here." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. "That claim legally yours?" "My father filed it properly. I have the papers." She paused. "Or I did before the fire. Copies would be in the land office in Trinidad." Adelaide shook her head. "Garrett owns the land office clerk. He'd make those papers disappear the moment I showed my face in town." "Maybe." Thomas set down his empty bowl. "But running won't solve anything. Garrett would just take the claim anyway, and you'd have nothing." "I already have nothing. You have your life, and you have a legal claim to valuable land." He looked at her directly, those pale eyes intense. "Sometimes the only way forward is to fight." Adelaide wanted to laugh, but it came out bitter. "Fight? I'm one woman against a man who owns half the county. I can barely shoot straight. My father tried to fight, and look where it got him." "Your father was alone. You're not." The words hung in the air between them. Adelaide stared at Thomas, not quite believing what she was hearing. "You don't even know me. Why would you help?" He was quiet for so long, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he said, "Because it's right. And because I'm tired of men like Garrett taking what they want and leaving good people dead in their wake." There was an old anger in his voice, something personal. Adelaide wondered what James Garrett had done to earn this mountain man's enmity, but she didn't ask. Instead, she said, "I can't pay you. Didn't ask you to. But get some rest, Miss Klein. We'll figure things out in the morning." He stood and moved toward the door, clearly ending the conversation. Adelaide wanted to argue, to insist she couldn't accept his help, but exhaustion crashed over her like a wave. She hadn't slept in a real bed in months. The thought of it made her bones ache with longing. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for everything." Thomas paused at the door, his hand on the latch. "Lock this behind me." Then he was gone into the night, and Adelaide was alone with the crackling fire and the overwhelming relief of safety. She locked the door as instructed, then stood there for a moment, trying to process everything that had happened. This morning, she'd been alone and hunted. Now, she had a strange, silent mountain man offering to fight her battles. She should have been suspicious, should have questioned his motives, but something in Thomas Young's steady gaze made her want to trust him, and Adelaide had learned to trust her instincts. They'd kept her alive this long. She stripped off her dusty clothes and found a clean shirt hanging on a peg. It was massive on her, falling past her knees, but it smelled of wood smoke and pine and something else she couldn't quite name. She climbed into the bed, which was surprisingly comfortable, and pulled the heavy quilts up to her chin. For the first time in 3 months, Adelaide Klein slept without waking at every sound. She woke to sunlight streaming through the window and the smell of coffee. For a confused moment, she didn't remember where she was. Then it all came flooding back: the attack, Thomas Young, the sanctuary of his cabin. Adelaide sat up and saw a bouquet on the table beside a steaming cup of coffee. Not a fancy arrangement, but wildflowers gathered from the mountain meadows, Indian paintbrush, columbine, wild roses. They'd been placed in a tin cup with obvious care, their colors bright against the rough wood. She stared at them, something tight forming in her chest. When was the last time anyone had given her flowers? Her father had been practical and gruff, loving in his way, but not given to such gestures. The boys in town had circled around her a few times, but her father's stern presence had kept them at bay, and then she'd been too busy helping him work the claim to think about courting. Adelaide crossed to the table and touched one of the rose petals with a fingertip. They were still damp with morning dew. She picked up the coffee and took a sip, strong and hot and perfect. Through the window, she could see Thomas working near the woodpile, his shirt off despite the morning chill, muscles moving under sun-bronzed skin as he split logs with rhythmic, powerful swings of the axe. She watched him for a moment, transfixed by the sheer physicality of him. He was built like men from ancient stories, all raw strength and capability. Then she caught herself staring and turned away, her face warm. Adelaide found her clothes from yesterday washed and hanging near the fire, almost dry. Someone Thomas had cleaned them while she slept. The kindness of it made her throat tight again. She dressed quickly, braided her hair, and stepped outside. Thomas looked up as she approached, driving the axe into the chopping block and reaching for his shirt. "Coffee all right?" "Perfect, thank you." Adelaide gestured back toward the cabin. "For everything. The clothes, the—" She hesitated, suddenly feeling foolish. The flowers. Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of uncertainty that seemed out of place on his hard features. "Figured you could use something pretty after yesterday. I can't remember the last time anyone gave me flowers." The words were out before she could stop them, more honest than she'd intended. Thomas studied her with those pale, searching eyes, and Adelaide had the strange sensation of being truly seen for the first time in years. "That's a shame," he said finally. "Women like you should have flowers." He said it so simply, so matter-of-factly, that Adelaide didn't know how to respond. She'd spent the last few years being her father's partner in the brutal work of mining, all rough hands and practical concerns. The men in Trinidad saw her as Klein's strange daughter, the one who wore pants and could handle dynamite. No one had looked at her and seen someone who deserved flowers. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted. "Accept help, I mean. I've been on my own for so long." Thomas nodded slowly. "I understand that. Been on my own most of my life. But there's a difference between choosing solitude and having it forced on you." He picked up the axe again. "You're welcome to stay as long as you need. No expectations, no obligations. Just figured you could use a safe place while we sort out this mess with Garrett." "We," Adelaide repeated. "You keep saying that. If you want my help, you have it. If you'd rather handle things yourself, I'll take you wherever you want to go." His gaze was steady, sincere. "Your choice, Miss Klein." Adelaide thought about riding away, trying to start over somewhere else with nothing but the clothes on her back. Thought about James Garrett claiming her father's land, profiting from murder. Thought about spending another night cold and hungry and afraid in a cave. I want to fight," she said. But I need to be smart about it. Garrett has men and money and the law in his pocket. Then we need to take those advantages away from him. Thomas split another log with one clean stroke. First thing is getting copies of those claim papers. If we can prove your ownership legally, it gets harder for Garrett to move against you openly. How do we get past his clerk? The land office has 2 clerks. The other one, Henry Matthews, is honest. Problem is, he's not usually there when Garrett's man is around. They work different shifts. Thomas paused, considering. But if we time it right, catch Matthews alone, we might have a chance. Adelaide felt a flicker of hope. You know Matthews? Knew his brother during the war. Good family. He won't be bought by someone like Garrett. When? Tomorrow's Sunday. Garrett's man won't be there, but Matthews sometimes goes in to catch up on paperwork. We ride down at dawn, keep it quiet. Adelaide nodded, her mind already working through the possibilities and dangers. Garrett might have men watching the town. Probably, but I know ways in that most folks don't. Thomas met her eyes. Trust me? It was the second time he'd asked her to trust him in so many words. Adelaide found she did, despite knowing him less than a day. There was something fundamentally solid about Thomas Young, like the mountains themselves. Yes, she said simply. He nodded once, then returned to his work. Adelaide watched him for a moment longer, then asked, What can I do? To help around here, I mean. I won't just sit idle. Thomas glanced at her, and she thought she saw approval in his expression. Smokehouse needs tending. Venison needs turning. I'll show you. He led her to the smokehouse, explaining his system for preserving meat, which game was ready and which needed more time. Adelaide listened carefully, filing away the information. Her father had taught her to hunt and shoot, but he'd never been much for the domestic skills. She'd learned what she had to, but this was different. Thomas's methods were refined by years of living entirely off the land. You do all this yourself? She asked, impressed despite herself. No choice up here. Town's half a day's ride, and I prefer to go infrequent as possible. He adjusted one of the hanging racks. Gets lonely sometimes, but it's better than being around people who expect things from you. Adelaide understood that sentiment deeply. What did you do before you came up here? Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his expression distant. Fought in the war. Came home to nothing, family gone, farm burned. Tried working in Denver for a while, but couldn't stomach being closed in anymore. So I came up into the mountains and just stayed. No family at all? Not anymore. He said it flatly, without self-pity, but Adelaide heard the weight of loss beneath the words. I'm sorry. Long time ago now. Thomas moved toward the door. I'll check the trap lines. Should be back before dark. You'll be safe here, but keep the rifle close just in case. He showed her where he kept his spare weapons, made sure she knew how to load and fire the rifle properly. Adelaide noticed he didn't condescend or assume she was helpless, just gave her the information and tools she needed. She appreciated that more than she could say. After Thomas left, Adelaide spent the day making herself useful. She tended the smokehouse, cleaned the cabin, and used the supplies she found to make a proper stew for dinner. It felt strange to be doing domestic work again after months of just surviving, but also oddly satisfying. There was comfort in routine, in having a purpose beyond simply not dying. She found herself thinking about Thomas as she worked, about the careful way he'd arranged the wildflowers, the gentleness in his hands despite their obvious strength. He was nothing like the men she'd known in Trinidad, not loud or boastful or constantly testing their dominance. He just existed, solid and sure, offering help without demanding anything in return. It had been so long since anyone had courted her, Adelaide realized. Years, really. There had been a boy when she was 18 before her mother died, but that had ended when her father moved them up to the mountain claim. Since then, it had been just her and her father, working from dawn to dusk, too exhausted for anything else. No one had given her flowers, no one had looked at her like she was anything other than Klein's odd daughter. But Thomas had given her flowers, had washed her clothes, had offered her safety without expecting anything. Adelaide didn't know what to do with that kindness. It felt precious and fragile, something she might break if she handled it wrong. When Thomas returned that evening with 3 rabbits and a handful of herbs, he found the cabin transformed. Adelaide had scrubbed everything, organized his scattered supplies, and made a dinner that filled the small space with savory smells. He paused in the doorway, something shifting across his weathered face. "You didn't have to do all this," he said. "I wanted to. Needed to do something useful." Adelaide ladled stew into bowls. "Besides, when was the last time someone cooked for you?" Thomas hung up his coat and gear, clearly thinking. "Few years at least. Then sit down and eat." He obeyed, and Adelaide felt a small thrill of satisfaction at the way his eyes widened at the first bite. She'd always been a decent cook, and having proper ingredients to work with made all the difference. "This is good," Thomas said, and the simple praise warmed her more than it should have. They ate in comfortable silence for a while. Then Adelaide asked, "What do you do up here all day? Besides hunting and trapping, I mean." "Read, mostly. Work on the cabin and outbuildings. There's a hot spring about a mile east. I go there sometimes." He gestured to the bookshelves. "Had some schooling before the war. Never lost the habit of reading." Adelaide examined the titles after dinner. Poetry, philosophy, adventure novels, even some scientific texts. It was an eclectic collection, clearly gathered over years of careful selection. "You can borrow any you'd like," Thomas offered. She pulled down a volume of Whitman's poetry, flipping through the worn pages. "You've read this one a lot. Reminds me there's beauty in the world. Easy to forget sometimes." Adelaide looked at him, this massive scarred mountain man who read poetry and picked wildflowers, and felt something shift in her chest, something warm and dangerous and entirely unexpected. Thank you," she said, "for letting me stay, for helping me. I know I keep saying it, but I mean it." Thomas met her eyes across the cabin, firelight playing across his features. "You don't need to keep thanking me, Miss Klein. Just having someone to talk to is payment enough." That night, Adelaide lay in Thomas's bed again while he slept in the barn, and found herself thinking about the way his hands moved when he worked, the rumble of his voice, the careful consideration in his eyes. She was falling into something, she realized, something that might be more dangerous than Garrett's hired guns, because she didn't know how to protect herself from it. But maybe she didn't want to. Adelaide woke before dawn to find another bouquet on the table, larkspur and mountain daisies this time, arranged with the same careful attention as yesterday. She touched the petals, smiling despite herself, then dressed quickly in her riding clothes. Thomas was already saddling the horses when she emerged. The morning was cold and clear, stars still visible overhead. He handed her a rifle and ammunition without comment, and Adelaide checked the weapon with practiced efficiency. They rode down from the high country in silence, taking paths Adelaide had never seen. Thomas moved like a ghost through the landscape, reading signs invisible to her eyes, choosing routes that kept them hidden from casual observation. By the time the sun rose, they were approaching Trinidad from the east, following a creek bed that provided natural cover. "Wait here," Thomas said, dismounting in a stand of cottonwoods near the town's edge. "I'll scout ahead, make sure the way's clear." He disappeared into the morning shadows, moving with remarkable silence for his size. Adelaide waited, checking and rechecking her rifle, her heart beating faster with each passing minute. She'd avoided Trinidad since her father's death, unable to face the town's collective indifference to his murder. Now she was sneaking back in like a criminal, trying to reclaim what was rightfully hers. Thomas returned 15 minutes later. "There's 2 men watching the main streets, but they're not paying much attention. Matthews is in the land office. I saw a lamplight. We go in the back way, through the alley behind the general store." They left the horses tied and moved on foot, keeping to the shadows. Trinidad was quiet this early on Sunday morning, most of the town still sleeping off Saturday night's revelries. Adelaide followed Thomas's lead, matching his careful movements, her hand tight on the rifle. The land office was a small building near the center of town, wedged between a saloon and a barber shop. Thomas led her around back, where a narrow door stood slightly ajar. He knocked twice, paused, then knocked once more. The door opened to reveal a thin man in his 40s, spectacles perched on his nose, ink stains on his fingers. His eyes widened when he saw Thomas, then moved to Adelaide with recognition and concern. "Miss Klein, Thomas, you shouldn't be here if Garrett's men see you." "They won't," Thomas said quietly. "We need those claim papers, Henry. Copies of Klein's filing." Henry Matthews glanced nervously over his shoulder, then stepped back to let them in. The office was cramped and dusty, filled with filing cabinets and ledgers. He moved to one cabinet, rifling through folders with practiced speed. "I heard what happened to your father," Henry said to Adelaide. "I'm sorry. He was a good man." "Did you know Garrett was behind it?" Adelaide asked, keeping her voice low. Henry's jaw tightened. "I suspected. Jackson, the other clerk, he's been making files disappear. Claims related to land Garrett wants. I've been keeping secondary copies hidden, but if he finds out..." He pulled out a folder, checked the contents, then handed it to Adelaide. "Here. Everything your father filed, including the original survey and the claim registration, all legal and proper." Adelaide clutched the papers like they were made of gold. "Thank you. This means everything." "What are you going to do with them?" Henry asked, worry clear in his voice. "Fight," Adelaide said simply. "I'm not letting Garrett steal my father's land." "He'll kill you. He's already killed." Henry cut himself off, glancing at Thomas. "Already killed who?" Thomas asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Henry hesitated, then sighed. "There's been others. 3 miners in the past year, all refusing to sell claims to Garrett, all found dead, accidents supposedly. The sheriff won't investigate, says there's no proof." "Because Garrett owns the sheriff," Adelaide said bitterly. "Not entirely," Henry corrected. "Sheriff Morrison is scared, but he's not corrupt. If you could prove Garrett was behind the murders, give Morrison something concrete, he might actually act on it." Thomas and Adelaide exchanged glances. Adelaide could see the calculation in his pale eyes, the strategic mind working through possibilities. "Would you testify?" Thomas asked Henry, "about the missing files, the pattern of deaths?" "If it came to it, yes. But you need more than my word. You need something that ties Garrett directly to what happened." "Like a witness," Adelaide murmured. "Someone who was there, who saw..." She broke off as voices carried from the street outside. Henry's face went pale. "You need to leave. Now. If Jackson finds you here." Thomas was already moving, guiding Adelaide toward the back door. They slipped out into the alley just as the front door of the land office opened, voices drifting through the building. They made it back to the horses without incident, but Adelaide's heart didn't stop racing until they were miles out of town, climbing back into the safety of the high country. She clutched the folder of papers against her chest, proof that her father's claim was legitimate, that she had a right to the land Garrett wanted so badly. "What now?" she asked as they paused to rest the horses. Thomas dismounted, checking their back trail with careful eyes. "Now we figure out how to prove Garrett gave the order to kill your father. Henry's right, we need a witness or concrete evidence. The men who attacked yesterday worked for Garrett. One of them got away." "He did." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "Man like that, probably drinking his fear away right now, might be persuaded to talk. You know where to find him?" "I can guess. There's a camp Garrett's men use about 10 miles south of here. Rough place, but they feel safe there." He looked at her seriously. "It would be dangerous. Very dangerous." Adelaide thought about her father, bleeding in the mud. Thought about 3 months of living in a cave like an animal. Thought about all the other miners Garrett had killed in his greed. "I'm not afraid," she said. Thomas studied her for a long moment, and something like respect showed in his expression. "I believe you. But we do this smart, not rash. We watch the camp, learn their patterns, find the right moment." They spent the rest of the day riding south, Thomas pointing out landmarks and teaching Adelaide to read the land the way he did. She was a quick study, her mind sharp despite her lack of formal education. By the time they made camp that evening in a hidden canyon, she could identify the signs of recent passage, distinguish animal tracks from human, and spot the subtle indications of water nearby. Thomas caught fish from the creek while Adelaide gathered firewood. They worked in tandem, the coordination coming naturally. As darkness fell and stars emerged overhead, they sat by the small fire, eating grilled trout and hard biscuits. "Tell me about your father," Thomas said quietly. "What was he like?" Adelaide smiled despite the ache in her chest. "Stubborn, determined. He came out here after my mother died, said he needed a new start. Dragged me along even though I'd just turned 18 and wanted to stay in Denver." She poked at the fire with a stick. "I was angry at first. Thought he was running away from grief, but once we got up here, started working the claim together, I understood. He needed purpose, something to build." "Did you love him?" "Very much. even when he drove me crazy with his stubbornness. She glanced at Thomas. What about your family? You said they were gone. Thomas's expression shuddered slightly, but he answered. Parents died of fever when I was 16. Older sister raised me until I went to war. She married while I was gone, had a baby. When I came back, I learned they'd all died when raiders burned the farm. Wrong place, wrong time. God, Thomas, I'm so sorry. He shrugged, but she could see the old pain in the set of his shoulders. Like I said, long time ago. But it's why I came up here. Couldn't stand being around people, around families. Reminded me too much of what I'd lost. Adelaide understood that instinct, the desire to hide from pain. Does it help? Being alone up here? Did for a while. Lately, he trailed off, staring into the fire. Lately, it's just been lonely. The admission hung between them, vulnerable and honest. Adelaide felt her heart twist. She moved slightly closer, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. I'm glad you found me yesterday, she said softly. Or I guess you found you. Either way, I'm glad. Thomas turned to look at her, and the intensity in his pale eyes made her breath catch. They were close enough that she could see the flecks of gray in his beard, the scars on his weathered face, the way the firelight played across his strong features. So am I, he said, his voice rough. For a moment, Adelaide thought he might kiss her. Wanted him to, she realized with surprise. But Thomas pulled back, standing abruptly and moving to check on the horses. Adelaide sat by the fire, her heart beating too fast, wondering what was happening between them and if she was brave enough to pursue it. That night, they slept on opposite sides of the fire, blankets wrapped tight against the mountain cold. But Adelaide found herself acutely aware of Thomas's presence, the sound of his breathing, the knowledge that he was right there if she needed him. She woke to find him already up, and there on her saddle was another small bouquet, wild roses and blue flax, tied with a strand of grass. Adelaide picked up the flowers, something warm and sweet blooming in her chest. She looked across the camp to where Thomas was saddling his horse, his back to her, and realized with sudden clarity that she'd never been courted before. Not really. The boys in Denver had been awkward and presumptuous, expecting things from her. Her father had always been too practical for romance, even with her mother. But Thomas picked her flowers every morning, not because he expected anything, but because he thought she deserved beauty, because he saw her as someone worth the effort. Thank you, she called across the camp. Thomas glanced back and she caught a glimpse of uncertainty on his face, as though he wasn't sure if the gesture was welcome. Adelaide smiled at him, genuine and warm, and tucked one of the roses into her braid. His expression softened, and he nodded before returning to his work. They reached the area near Garrett's camp by mid-morning. Thomas found a vantage point on a rocky outcrop that overlooked the canyon where the camp was situated. Adelaide could see several rough shelters, a corral with horses, and men moving around a central fire. There, Thomas murmured, handing her a small spyglass. The one by the water barrel. That's the man who ran yesterday. Adelaide focused the glass and saw him a thin, nervous-looking man with a bandage on his arm. He kept glancing around as though expecting attack, and he had a bottle in his hand, even though it was barely noon. He's scared, she observed. Good. Scared men make mistakes. We wait until dark, then I'll get him alone. We'll get him alone, Adelaide corrected. Thomas looked at her sharply. Adelaide. It's my fight, Thomas. My father who was killed. I need to be there. She could see him wanting to argue, to keep her safe, but something in her expression must have convinced him. He nodded reluctantly. You follow my lead exactly. No improvising. Understood? Understood. They waited through the long afternoon, watching the camp, learning the patterns and routines. Adelaide counted 7 men in total, all of them armed and dangerous looking. As evening fell, they began drinking heavily around the fire, their voices carrying up to the outcrop. Garrett's not paying us enough for this, one man complained. Klein's girl has that mountain man protecting her now. You saw what he did to Collins and Wayne. Should just leave her alone, another agreed. It's just a claim. There's other silver in these mountains. Garrett don't see it that way, a third man said. He wants that specific claim, and he'll keep sending us until she's dead or gone. The nervous man took a long drink. I ain't going back up there. That mountain man will kill me. Then you better hope Garrett doesn't find out you're a coward. Adelaide glanced at Thomas. His expression was hard, calculating. She could practically see him planning their next moves. As full darkness fell, the men gradually dispersed to their shelters. The nervous man went to the creek. Stumbling slightly, the bottle had clearly taken effect. Thomas touched Adelaide's arm and gestured. Time to move. They descended from the outcrop in silence, circling wide around the camp. Thomas moved like a ghost, and Adelaide did her best to match him, grateful for the soft-soled boots she wore. They reached the creek upstream from the man, positioning themselves in the shadows of overhanging willows. The man finished his business and turned back toward camp, but Thomas stepped into his path. In the moonlight, Thomas looked enormous, more spirit than man. The man froze, his face draining of color. "Please," he whispered, "please don't kill me." "That depends," Thomas said quietly, "on whether you tell us what we need to know." Adelaide emerged from the shadows, and the man's eyes went wide with recognition and terror. "You," he breathed. "Me," Adelaide confirmed. "You tried to kill me yesterday, you and your friends." "I didn't want to. Garrett said you were trespassing, that you'd attacked his men first." "Liar," Adelaide hissed. "My father filed that claim legally, and Garrett had him murdered for it." "I wasn't there," the man protested. "I swear, I wasn't there when your pa died. That was Garrett's other crew, the ones he keeps for the real dirty work." Thomas stepped closer, and the man actually whimpered. "But you know about it," Thomas said. "You know Garrett gave the order." "Everyone knows. He don't even try to hide it from us. Says he owns the sheriff, owns the land office, owns half the county." The words tumbled out in a terrified rush. "Please, I got a wife, I got kids." "Then you should find better employment," Adelaide said coldly. "Because right now, you're going to write down everything you know about Garrett's operations. Every illegal claim jump, every murder, every bribe. All of it." "He'll kill me." "We'll kill you if you don't," Thomas said simply. "Choose." The man's face crumpled. "I can't write. Never learned." Adelaide had anticipated this. She pulled out paper and a pencil she'd taken from Thomas's cabin. "Then you'll talk, and I'll write. And when we're done, you're going to sign it with your mark." They took him back up to the outcrop, far enough from camp that they could light a small lantern. For the next hour, Adelaide wrote while the man talked, spilling everything he knew about Garrett's criminal enterprise. The murders, the bribes, the intimidation, names and dates and details that painted a damning picture. When they were done, the man made his mark at the bottom of the pages. His hand shook so badly he could barely hold the pencil. "What now?" he asked. "You going to kill me anyway?" Thomas studied him for a long moment. "No, but you're going to leave Colorado tonight. Take your family and go, and don't come back. Because if I see you again, I won't be merciful." The man nodded frantically, then scrambled down the rocks toward camp. Thomas and Adelaide watched him go, then gathered their things and headed back to their own horses. They rode hard for several hours, putting distance between themselves and Garrett's camp before finally stopping to make a cold camp in a protected canyon. Adelaide's hands were still shaking slightly from the adrenaline and tension. "You did well," Thomas said, settling beside her with their saddlebags. "Kept your head, stayed calm." "I was terrified," Adelaide admitted. "Being scared and doing it anyway is what courage is." He handed her some jerky and a canteen. "Your father would be proud." The words made her throat tight. "Do you really think this will be enough, this testimony? Along with Henry Matthews's evidence about the missing files and the legal claim papers?" "It should be. Garrett can't buy his way out of written proof." Thomas paused. "But he'll try. And when he realizes he's cornered, he'll be dangerous." "More dangerous than he already is?" "Different dangerous. Desperate men make desperate choices." Adelaide chewed the jerky, thinking. "We need to take this to someone who can act on it. But who? The sheriff is scared of Garrett. The territorial marshal is based in Denver. And by the time we get there—" "There's a federal judge who rides circuit through this area," Thomas interrupted. "Judge Harlan. He's honest. And he's not afraid of men like Garrett. He's due in Trinidad next week for the quarterly session." "A week? Can we stay hidden for a week?" "Up in the high country? Easy. Garrett's men won't find us there." Thomas looked at her in the darkness. "You can stay at my cabin, safe and warm. I'll hunt, we'll gather evidence, and when the judge arrives, we'll bring everything to him all at once." It was a good plan. A solid plan. Adelaide nodded slowly. All right, we do this right, end it properly. They rode back to Thomas's cabin over the next day, taking a winding route that obscured their trail. Adelaide found herself relaxing as they climbed higher into the mountains, as though the elevation itself provided safety. When the cabin finally came into view, she felt an unexpected surge of homecoming, which was absurd. She'd been here only a few days, but somehow, in that short time, it had started to feel like sanctuary. Over the following days, they fell into a comfortable routine. Thomas would leave early to check trap lines and hunt, always returning with game, and Adelaide's heart would lift every time a small bouquet of wildflowers. They were never elaborate, just simple mountain blooms, but Thomas arranged them with such care that they felt precious. Adelaide would tend the smokehouse, cook meals, and work on organizing their evidence against Garrett. In the evenings, they'd sit by the fire, talking about everything and nothing. Thomas told her about the mountains, the wildlife, the changing seasons. Adelaide told him about Denver before she left, the books she'd read, the dreams she'd had before her father moved them up here. One evening, as they sat close by the fire, Adelaide finally asked the question that had been nagging at her. Why do you keep picking me flowers? Thomas was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he said, his voice low, because you said no one ever had. Seemed wrong, a woman like you never being courted proper. Adelaide's breath caught. Is that what you're doing? Courting me? He turned to look at her, and the vulnerability in his expression made her chest ache. Been trying to? Don't have much practice at it. If I'm doing it wrong. You're not, Adelaide said quickly. You're doing it perfectly. I didn't think anyone would ever look at me that way. I'm not exactly the delicate type. Never wanted delicate, Thomas said. You're strong and smart and brave. Most beautiful thing I've ever seen. No one had ever called Adelaide beautiful before. Pretty sometimes when she was younger and took time with her appearance. But not beautiful, and certainly not with the reverence Thomas put into the word. I don't know how to do this either, she confessed. The courting. I've been so focused on surviving, on fighting, I forgot what it was like to just feel things. Thomas reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. His touch was gentle, calloused fingers barely grazing her skin, but it sent shivers down her spine. We'll figure it out together, he said softly. Adelaide leaned into his touch, her eyes closing. When she opened them again, Thomas was closer, his face inches from hers. She could see every detail, the gray in his beard, the faint scar through his eyebrow, the way his pupils had dilated. Can I kiss you? He asked, his voice rough. Adelaide answered by closing the distance between them. The kiss was gentle at first, almost tentative, as though Thomas was afraid of hurting her. But Adelaide pressed closer, her hands coming up to tangle in his hair, and he responded with a low sound that made heat pool in her belly. He pulled her against him, one large hand cradling the back of her head, the other wrapping around her waist. Adelaide had been kissed before, awkward fumbling experiences that left her unimpressed. This was nothing like that. This was consuming, overwhelming, like being caught in a river current. Thomas kissed her like she was something precious and urgent all at once, and Adelaide felt years of loneliness crack open inside her. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. Been wanting to do that since the first morning, he admitted. Saw you looking at those flowers, smiling, and just wanted. Why didn't you? Didn't want to rush you. Didn't want you to think I expected anything in return for helping you. Adelaide pulled back enough to look him in the eyes. I would never think that. You've been nothing but respectful and kind. But Thomas, I want this. I want you. Something fierce and possessive flared in his expression. Adelaide, I'm not saying we have to. I mean, I'm not. She felt her face heat, struggling for words. I just mean I want to explore this, whatever this is between us. Thomas cupped her face in his large hands, his touch infinitely gentle. There's no rush. We have time. And I want to do this right, court you proper. You deserve that. The sweetness of it made Adelaide want to cry. Instead, she kissed him again, softer this time, pouring gratitude and affection and budding love into the gesture. Thomas held her like she was something infinitely valuable, and for the first time in months, maybe years, Adelaide felt safe enough to just be soft. They sat by the fire late into the night, Adelaide tucked against Thomas's broad chest, his arms around her. They talked and kissed and simply enjoyed each other's presence. When Adelaide finally grew too tired to keep her eyes open, Thomas walked her to the bed, kissed her forehead, and turned to leave for the barn. "Stay," Adelaide said impulsively. Just sleep here. I don't want to be alone tonight." Thomas hesitated, clearly torn. "Adelaide, I don't want to compromise." "You won't. I trust you." She smiled at him. "Besides, it's your bed. I'm the one who's been taking it. Just sleep next to me, please." After a long moment, Thomas nodded. They lay down together, Adelaide curled against his chest, his arm wrapped protectively around her. It was the most intimate thing Adelaide had ever done, this simple act of sleeping beside another person, and it felt absolutely right. She woke the next morning to sunlight, and the by now familiar sight of flowers on the Table Mountain bluebells this time. But more significantly, she woke wrapped in Thomas's warmth, his steady heartbeat beneath her ear. He was already awake, she realized, but he hadn't moved, content to let her sleep. "Morning," she murmured. "Morning." His voice rumbled in his chest. "Sleep all right?" "Best I've slept in years." Adelaide tilted her head back to look at him. "Thank you for staying. Thank you for asking me to." He brushed a kiss across her forehead. "Didn't realize how much I missed this, just being close to someone." They lay there for a while longer, neither wanting to break the moment, but eventually practicality intruded. There were chores to do, preparations to make for their trip back to Trinidad to meet with the judge. The next few days passed in a blur of domesticity and growing intimacy. Adelaide and Thomas worked side by side during the days, and at night they'd sit close by the fire, talking and kissing and slowly learning each other. Thomas taught her to shoot more accurately, to track and hunt. Adelaide taught him recipes her mother had known, songs from her childhood. Every morning, without fail, there were fresh wildflowers waiting for her. "Where do you even find them all?" Adelaide asked one morning, arranging a bouquet of yarrow and purple asters. "We're so high up here." Thomas smiled, that rare full smile that transformed his harsh features. "I know where to look. Been roaming these mountains for 10 years. I know every meadow and hidden valley." "You must wake up very early to gather them before I get up. Worth it to see your face when you find them." Adelaide crossed the cabin and kissed him thoroughly. "You're going to spoil me for any other man." "Good," Thomas said against her lips. "Don't want you looking at any other man." The possessiveness in his voice shouldn't have thrilled her, but it did. Adelaide had spent so long being independent, needing no one, that the idea of being claimed by this strong, gentle mountain man felt like freedom rather than constraint. "I'm only looking at you," she promised. As the week drew to a close, they prepared to return to Trinidad. The plan was to approach Henry Matthews first, get him to bring the evidence to Judge Harlan privately. That way, Garrett wouldn't know what was happening until it was too late to interfere. They rode down from the high country on the morning the judge was due to arrive, taking the hidden paths Thomas knew. Adelaide had the sworn testimony and her father's claim papers in her saddlebags, wrapped carefully in oilcloth. Her heart hammered with nervousness and anticipation. This was it. Either they'd succeed in bringing Garrett to justice, or they'd fail and likely end up dead. Thomas must have sensed her anxiety, because he reached across the distance between their horses and squeezed her hand. "Whatever happens, we face it together." "Together," Adelaide agreed. They reached Trinidad by noon and went straight to Henry Matthews's house rather than the land office. Henry opened the door with a startled expression that quickly turned to relief. "Thank God. I was starting to worry Garrett had found you." He ushered them inside quickly, checking the street before closing the door. "Judge Harlan arrived this morning. He's staying at the hotel, holding preliminary meetings at the courthouse." "Can you get him to see us?" Thomas asked. "Privately?" "I think so. He knows me from previous circuits. If I tell him it's urgent." Henry looked at Adelaide. "What do you have?" Adelaide laid out everything: the testimony from Garrett's man, the evidence of the pattern of murders and claim jumping, her father's legal papers proving ownership. Henry's eyes grew wider as he read through it all. "This is damning," he said finally. "If even half of this can be corroborated, Garrett won't just lose his claims, he'll hang." "He deserves to hang," Adelaide said flatly, "for my father and all the others." Henry nodded gravely. "Let me go to the judge. You two stay here, out of sight. I'll come back with his answer." He left, and Adelaide paced Henry's small parlor nervously. Thomas sat calmly in a chair, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand rested on his rifle. "What if the judge won't see us?" Adelaide asked. "What if Garrett has gotten to him too? Then we go to Denver, find someone who will listen." Thomas looked at her steadily. "I told you we're not giving up." Adelaide stopped pacing and crossed to him, needing to be close. Thomas pulled her into his lap and she wrapped her arms around his neck, drawing strength from his solid presence. "I'm scared," she admitted. "I know, so am I. But you're the bravest woman I've ever met, Adelaide Klein, and I'll stand beside you no matter what happens." She kissed him, pouring all her fear and love and hope into the gesture. Thomas held her tight. For a moment, Adelaide let herself imagine a future where this was resolved, where she could just be with him without threat hanging over them. Henry returned an hour later, slightly out of breath. "He'll see you. Now, at the courthouse, in his private chambers. But you need to come quickly before word spreads that you're in town." They followed Henry through the back streets, avoiding the main thoroughfares. The courthouse was an imposing building of red brick, the finest structure in Trinidad. Henry led them through a side entrance and up a narrow staircase to a wood-paneled office. Judge Harlan was a stern-looking man in his 60s, with iron-gray hair and sharp eyes. He stood when they entered, studying Adelaide and Thomas with obvious assessment. "Miss Klein, Mr. Young, Henry here tells me you have information about criminal activities related to several mining claims in this area." His voice was clipped and authoritative. "I should tell you up front that James Garrett is a respected businessman in this territory. Whatever accusations you make will need to be substantiated." "I have documentation," Adelaide said, her voice stronger than she felt. She laid out all the evidence on the judge's desk. "Sworn testimony from one of Garrett's men detailing murders and claim jumping. My father's legal papers proving his ownership. Evidence of a pattern spanning multiple deaths." Judge Harlan sat down and began reading. The room was silent except for the rustle of papers and the ticking of a clock on the wall. Adelaide held her breath, watching his expression for any sign of his reaction. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, the judge looked up. "This is serious. Very serious. If what's documented here is true, we're talking about multiple counts of murder, conspiracy, fraud, and corruption." He fixed Adelaide with a penetrating stare. "You understand that making false accusations of this magnitude could result in charges against you?" "I understand. And it's all true. Every word." "Henry, you say you have evidence of missing land office files." "Yes, Your Honor. I've been keeping private records of discrepancies, files that should exist but have vanished, always related to claims Garrett later acquired." Judge Harlan nodded slowly. "And you're willing to testify to this under oath?" "I am." "Then here's what we're going to do." The judge stood, his expression hard. "I'm going to issue a warrant for James Garrett's arrest immediately. We'll also arrest his known associates based on the testimony here. The territorial marshal happens to be visiting Trinidad. I'll have him execute the warrants with federal authority." He looked at Thomas and Adelaide. "You two will need to testify in court. Are you prepared for that?" "Yes," Adelaide said without hesitation. "It won't be easy. Garrett will have expensive lawyers. They'll try to discredit you, claim you're motivated by greed or revenge." "Let them try," Adelaide said. "I have the truth on my side." Judge Harlan's severe expression softened slightly. "I believe you do, Miss Klein. And I promise you, justice will be served. Your father deserved better than what happened to him." The emotion Adelaide had been holding back suddenly threatened to overwhelm her. She nodded, not trusting her voice. Thomas stood. "How long before you make the arrests?" "Within the hour. I want Garrett secured before word of this spreads. I'll have the marshal bring extra men from his detail. I suggest you two stay here in the courthouse until Garrett is in custody, for your own safety." It was good advice. Adelaide and Thomas settled in a side room to wait while Judge Harlan and Henry set things in motion. Through the window, Adelaide could see the main street of Trinidad, people going about their business, unaware that everything was about to change. "You did it," Thomas said quietly. You got justice for your father." "We did it," Adelaide corrected. "I couldn't have done any of this without you." Thomas pulled her close, and Adelaide rested her head against his chest, listening to his heartbeat. They stayed like that for a long time, wrapped in each other, until raised voices and commotion outside drew them to the window. They saw the territorial marshal and 6 armed deputies surrounding Garrett's mining office. James Garrett himself emerged, red-faced and shouting, but the marshal clapped irons on his wrists without ceremony. Several other men were arrested as well, all of them protesting loudly. Adelaide watched it happen with grim satisfaction. This man had killed her father, destroyed her life, and nearly succeeded in stealing everything. Now he was the one in chains, being hauled to the jail like a common criminal. "It's over," she whispered. "Not yet," Thomas said. "Still have the trial. But you're safe now. That's what matters." Judge Harlan returned a short while later. "Garrett and 5 of his men are in custody. The marshal is rounding up the others named in the testimony. I've set a trial date for 2 weeks from now that should give both sides time to prepare." He looked at Adelaide seriously. "You should know, Garrett is already demanding his lawyer be sent for from Denver. This won't be a simple proceeding." "I don't care how complicated it gets," Adelaide said. "I'll testify to whatever you need." "Good. In the meantime, I've issued an order protecting your claim. Garrett's operations on that land are suspended, pending the trial's outcome." He paused. "Where are you staying? I can arrange lodging in town if needed." Adelaide glanced at Thomas, who said, "We'll stay at my place, in the mountains. Safer there." Judge Harlan nodded. "Probably wise. I'll send word when I need you back for the trial." They left Trinidad as sunset painted the mountains gold and red. Adelaide felt lighter than she had in months, as though a physical weight had been lifted from her shoulders. Garrett was in jail. Her claim was protected. Justice was actually happening. As they rode up into the high country, Adelaide kept looking over at Thomas, this strong, quiet man who had saved her life and given her so much more than just safety. He'd given her flowers every morning, had courted her with patience and gentleness, had stood beside her when he had no obligation to do so. She was falling in love with him, had probably already fallen. When they reached the cabin, Thomas dismounted and helped Adelaide down, his hands lingering on her waist. In the fading light, his eyes were the color of mountain ice, intense and focused entirely on her. "Adelaide," he said, his voice rough, "I need to tell you something." Her heart skipped. "What?" "I know this all started because you needed help, because Garrett was after you and you had nowhere to go. But somewhere along the way, it became more than that for me." He cupped her face in his large hands. "I love you. I love your strength and your courage and the way you look at wildflowers like they're treasure. I love that you're not afraid of this life, of the hardship and isolation. I love everything about you." Adelaide felt tears prick her eyes. "Thomas, you don't have to say anything back. I just needed you to know. And I want you to know that when this is all over, when Garrett's dealt with and your claim is secure, if you want to stay here with me, I'd count myself the luckiest man alive. But if you want to go back to Denver or anywhere else, I'll help you get there. Your happiness matters more than anything." Adelaide rose on her toes and kissed him, fierce and desperate. "I love you too, you stubborn mountain man. I think I started falling that first morning when I found flowers waiting for me. And yes, I want to stay. I want to build a life here with you, if you'll have me." Thomas made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob, then kissed her like a drowning man finding air. They stumbled into the cabin, hands tangling in each other's clothes, months of tension and restrained desire finally breaking free. "Wait," Thomas gasped, pulling back. "Adelaide, I want to do this right. Want to marry you proper before—" "Then marry me," Adelaide said. "We'll go to the courthouse after the trial. I don't need a fancy wedding or a church ceremony. I just need you." "You're sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything." Thomas kissed her again, softer this time, reverently. "Then you'll be my wife, and I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret it." They made love that night with the tenderness of new lovers learning each other, Thomas treating Adelaide like she was made of something infinitely precious. Afterwards, wrapped in his arms in the bed they now shared, Adelaide felt a peace she'd never known before. "Thank you," she whispered against his chest. "For what?" "For seeing me. for courting me when no one else ever bothered, for making me feel like I'm worth something beyond what I can do or survive." Thomas tilted her chin up so she met his eyes. "You're worth everything, Adelaide. Don't ever doubt that." The 2 weeks before the trial passed in a golden haze. Adelaide and Thomas spent their days preparing for testimony, but mostly they just existed together, reveling in the newness of acknowledged love. Thomas continued to bring her wildflowers every morning, even though she'd teased him that he could stop now that they were together. "Never stopping," he'd said firmly. "You're my wife in all but law, and wives deserve flowers." The trial itself was intense and difficult. Garrett's lawyer was slick and aggressive, trying to paint Adelaide as a gold digger and Thomas as a violent outsider. But the evidence was too strong, the testimony too damning. Garrett's own man broke down on the stand and confessed to everything, implicating his boss completely. After 3 days of proceedings, Judge Harlan sentenced James Garrett to hang for murder and conspiracy. His associates received lesser sentences, but all of them would spend significant time in territorial prison. Adelaide sat in the courthouse and watched it happen, Thomas's hand clasped firmly in hers. When it was over, when Garrett was led away in chains, she felt her father's ghost finally settle. "It's done," she said quietly. "It's done," Thomas agreed. "You did good, Adelaide, real good." They were married that afternoon in Judge Harlan's chambers, with Henry Matthews and his wife as witnesses. Adelaide wore the nicest dress she owned, borrowed from Mrs. Matthews, and Thomas had shaved and trimmed his hair, looking almost civilized. But his hand shook slightly as he slid the simple gold band on her finger, and his voice was rough with emotion when he said his vows. Adelaide promised to love and honor this mountain man for the rest of her days, and she meant every word. They spent their wedding night in a hotel in Trinidad, a rare indulgence. But the next morning, they rode back up into the high country, back to the cabin that was now officially their home. "What do you want to do with your father's claim?" Thomas asked as they settled back into their routine. "Work it yourself? Sell it?" Adelaide had been thinking about that question for days. "I think I want to work it, but not like before. Not tearing up the mountain for every ounce of silver, just enough to get by, to have a small income. The rest of the time." She looked around at the mountains, the endless sky. "I want to live here, really live, not just survive. Raise a family if we're blessed, build something lasting." Thomas pulled her close. "That sounds perfect." Over the next year, they did exactly that. Thomas taught Adelaide everything he knew about living off the land, and she proved to be a quick study. They worked her father's claim a few months each year, taking just enough silver to sell for supplies and necessities. The rest of the time, they hunted and gathered and tended their expanding homestead. Adelaide had never been happier. She woke every morning to wildflowers and Thomas's solid presence. They talked for hours by the fire at night, made love under furs and quilts, built a life together in the wild mountain places. When Adelaide discovered she was pregnant the following spring, Thomas actually cried, pressing his face against her still flat belly with wonder and gratitude. "Going to be a father," he kept murmuring. "Got a family again." Their son was born in early winter, delivered with help from a midwife Thomas brought up from Trinidad. They named him James, after Adelaide's father, and he had Thomas's pale blue eyes and Adelaide's stubborn determination. Thomas was besotted from the first moment, this huge mountain man cradling the tiny infant with infinite gentleness. Adelaide watched him rock their son by the firelight and felt her heart might burst with love. This was everything she'd never known to want a partner who cherished her, a child, a home built on respect and affection rather than just necessity. "Thank you," she told Thomas one evening as they sat together, the baby asleep in a cradle Thomas had carved himself. "For what?" Thomas asked, the same question he'd asked over a year ago when she'd thanked him the first time. "For picking me wildflowers, for showing me what it means to be courted, to be loved properly, for giving me all this." She gestured around at the cabin, at their sleeping son, at the life they'd built. Thomas kissed her temple. "You gave me just as much, gave me a reason to come down from the mountain, to let someone in again. You saved me just as much as I saved you." They had 2 more children over the following years, a daughter named Rose, and another son they called William. The cabin expanded to accommodate their growing family, additions and improvements made each summer. Thomas taught all the children to hunt and track and read the mountain signs. Adelaide taught them reading and arithmetic, and the stories her mother had told her. Sometimes people from Trinidad would come by, seeking Thomas's help or Adelaide's counsel. They'd become something of legends in the area, the mountain man and the woman who'd brought down James Garrett. Adelaide always welcomed visitors with coffee and hospitality, but she was just as happy when they left and it was just her family again. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Thomas woke Adelaide with a kiss and a bouquet of wildflowers, the same ritual that had never stopped in all their years together. "Still courting me?" Adelaide teased, arranging the flowers in a tin cup their son James had made for her. "Always," Thomas said seriously, "every day for the rest of our lives." Adelaide pulled him close, breathing in his familiar scent of pine and wood smoke and home. "I never thought I'd have this, never thought anyone would see me as worth the effort." "Then those other men were fools." Thomas cupped her face in his calloused hands. "You're the most remarkable woman I've ever known, Adelaide Young, and I'll spend every morning for the rest of my life picking you flowers to prove it." She kissed him then, deep and sweet, tasting love and commitment and a future stretching out before them like the endless Colorado mountains. Outside, their children played in the meadow, their laughter carrying on the wind. The silver claim sat mostly dormant, worked just enough to provide modest income. The cabin stood solid and warm, filled with books and memories and love. Adelaide had lost everything once: her father, her home, her safety. But in losing, she'd found something immeasurably better. She'd found a partner who saw her strength as something to celebrate, rather than something that made her less feminine. She'd found a man who understood that real courtship wasn't about grand gestures, but consistent, daily affirmation of love. She'd found home, not in a building or a place, but in Thomas's steady presence and gentle hands and morning wildflowers. Some people in Trinidad still talked about the Klein claim and the trial that had shaken the territory. They spoke of Adelaide's courage and Thomas's deadly accuracy with a rifle. But up in their mountain sanctuary, Adelaide and Thomas didn't think much about the past. They were too busy living a rich, full present, building a future for their children, and loving each other with the kind of deep, abiding devotion that only grows stronger with time. Every morning, Thomas still picked wildflowers. Every morning, Adelaide's heart still lifted at the sight of them. It was a small ritual, barely worth mentioning to outsiders, but to Adelaide it represented everything. It meant she was cherished, valued, seen. It meant that even in the harsh wilderness of the Colorado Territory, there was room for tenderness and beauty and the careful tending of love. She had never been courted before Thomas Young rode into her life, but once he started, he never stopped, and Adelaide knew with absolute certainty that he never would. Not until the day one of them drew their last breath, and probably not even then. Because love like theirs, forged in hardship, tempered by trust and nurtured by daily devotion, was the kind that transcended everything. The mountain man had taught the survivor how to live again. The woman who'd never been courted had shown the lonely hermit what it meant to be loved. Together, they'd built something neither could have created, alone: a family, a home, a legacy that would echo through the Colorado mountains long after they were gone. And it all started with wildflowers, picked fresh each morning, given with calloused hands and a heart that had finally found its home. Years continued to unfold with the rhythm of seasons in the high country. Their children grew strong and capable, learning the mountains as Thomas and Adelaide had. James, their eldest, showed his grandfather's determination and his father's quiet strength. Rose had her mother's sharp mind and fearless spirit. William was gentler, loving books and poetry like his father, but no less capable in the wilderness. Thomas aged like the mountains themselves, slowly, his strength enduring even as silver streaked his hair and deepened the lines around his eyes. Adelaide grew older beside him, her hands becoming weathered from years of work, but her spirit remained as fierce as ever. They were partners in every sense, sharing labor and decisions in the raising of their children. When James turned 18, he asked to work the silver claim more seriously, to expand their modest operation. Thomas and Adelaide discussed it long into the night before agreeing, with conditions. The land would be respected, not ravaged. Profits would be shared among all of them. and the claim would remain family-held, never sold to outside interests. The decision proved wise. James managed the operation with his grandfather's integrity and his parents' work ethic, bringing in enough income that his younger siblings could have choices they might not have had otherwise. Rose went to Denver for 2 years of schooling, returning with new ideas and skills. William became a teacher, riding circuit through the smaller mountain settlements. Through it all, Thomas and Adelaide remained the center of their growing family. They were grandparents eventually, then great-grandparents, their cabin always open to children and grandchildren who came seeking wisdom or simply comfort. And every single morning, even when his joints ached and his steps were slower, Thomas picked wildflowers for Adelaide. Some mornings he couldn't go far, managing only the blooms growing near the cabin, but he never missed a day, and Adelaide never failed to smile when she found them waiting. "You're going to wear yourself out," she scolded gently one morning when Thomas was past 70, watching him labor up the path with a bouquet of late-summer asters. "Worth it," he said simply, arranging them in the same tin cup their son had made decades before. Besides, made a promise, every day for the rest of our lives. Adelaide crossed the cabin and wrapped her arms around him, her head resting against his broad chest, the same way it had 40 years earlier. His arms came around her automatically, still strong despite the years, still protective and sure. "I love you," she said, "more than I thought possible to love another person." "I love you too. From that first morning, when you were covered in dust and pointing a non-existent gun at me." Thomas chuckled. "Knew then you were something special." They stood there in the sunlight, streaming through the windows. Two people who had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful from survival and circumstance and daily choice. The cabin was quiet, their children grown and gone to their own homes, though they visited often. It was just the two of them again, the way it had been in those early days, but richer now with decades of shared history. Adelaide thought about that terrified girl fleeing for her life, certain she would die alone in the mountains. She could never have imagined this future, this love, this family, this profound sense of belonging. Thomas had given her all of it, starting with simple wildflowers and patient, consistent devotion. "What are you thinking about?" Thomas asked, his chin resting atop her head. "How lucky I am. How I never knew it was possible to be this happy." "Same here. Every day with you is a gift, Adelaide." They spent the day as they spent most days now, working at a slower pace, tending their garden and animals, reading in the afternoon sun. Thomas still went to check his trap lines occasionally, though he'd taught his grandsons to do most of that work now. Adelaide still cooked and kept the cabin, though her daughter-in-law often sent provisions up the mountain to spare her the effort. But the rhythms of their life together remained unchanged. The quiet conversations, the comfortable silences, the way Thomas would reach for Adelaide's hand while they sat by the fire, the way Adelaide would smile when she found her morning flowers. They were old now, the wild west of their youth fading into a new century with telephones and automobiles beginning to appear even in remote Colorado. But up in their mountain sanctuary, time moved differently. The cabin Thomas had built still stood strong. The trees he'd cut and planted had grown tall. The land they'd stewarded remained beautiful and wild, and the love they'd forged in hardship and nurtured through decades remained unbreakable. One particularly cold winter morning, when Adelaide was past 75 and Thomas pushing 80, she woke to find her morning flowers waiting as always. But Thomas was still beside her in bed, breathing labored, his face drawn with pain. "Thomas?" Fear clutched at Adelaide's heart. "I'm all right," he said, but she could see he wasn't. Adelaide sent for their son, who brought a doctor up the mountain. The diagnosis was what she'd feared. Thomas's heart was failing. The doctor was kind, but honest. Days, maybe a week or two if they were fortunate. Their family gathered, filling the cabin with love and tears and memories. But Thomas wanted time alone with Adelaide, so their children and grandchildren respected that, staying in the expansion rooms and giving them space. "I'm sorry," Thomas said, his voice weaker than Adelaide had ever heard it. "Promised you every day for the rest of our lives, going to come up short soon." Adelaide felt tears streaming down her face, but she managed to smile. "You kept that promise, Thomas Young, every single day for 50 years. That's more than I ever dreamed of. Wish I had 50 more to give you." "Me too, but I'm grateful for what we had." She clasped his hand, feeling how frail it had become, though the love in his grip was still strong. You gave me everything, showed me what it means to be cherished and loved and seen. I was nothing when you found me, just a scared girl running for her life. You made me into who I am. You were always strong, Thomas corrected gently. I just gave you room to see it. They lay together in the bed they'd shared for half a century, holding each other as the winter sun tracked across the floor. Thomas's breathing grew shallower as the day wore on, but he remained conscious, his pale eyes fixed on Adelaide's face. Tell me again, he whispered as twilight fell, about the first morning with the flowers. Adelaide smiled through her tears. I woke up alone in a strange cabin, scared and exhausted, and there on the table was a bouquet of wildflowers in a tin cup. I couldn't remember the last time anyone had done something just to make me smile. It was the moment I started to believe maybe everything would be all right. Best decision I ever made, Thomas said. Picking those flowers led to everything else, led to you loving me. I would have loved you anyway, but the flowers helped me see what kind of man you were, gentle and thoughtful under all that mountain man gruffness. Thomas's eyes were drifting closed, but he smiled. Love you, Adelaide. Always have, always will. I love you too, so much it hurts. Don't hurt, be happy. You gave me everything I never thought I'd have again. Family, purpose, love. Die a fortunate man because of you. Thomas. But he was gone, his last breath sighing out peacefully, his hand still clasped in Adelaide's. She sat there holding him as full darkness fell, memorizing his face one final time, this mountain man who had saved her life and given her a love story for the ages. Their son found them that way hours later. Adelaide curled against Thomas's still form, tears dried on her cheeks but her expression peaceful. She let them take Thomas's body, let them make arrangements, but she moved through the following days in a fog of grief. The funeral was huge. Thomas and Adelaide had touched so many lives over the years. People came from Trinidad and the surrounding settlements, all of them with stories about the mountain man's quiet kindness or Adelaide's fierce courage. They buried Thomas on a ridge overlooking the valley, where he'd picked wildflowers so many mornings, under a sky as blue as his eyes. Adelaide thought she might not survive losing him. 50 years together, and suddenly she was alone again. But her children rallied around her, and gradually she found her footing. She was old, but still strong, still capable. And she had Thomas's legacy to honor, a life to finish living in his memory. She remained in the cabin, refusing all offers to move to town or live with her children. This was her home, the place where she and Thomas had built their life together. She couldn't leave it. And every morning, Adelaide picked herself wildflowers. It felt important, a way of continuing the ritual Thomas had started, of honoring the courtship that had never ended. Her hands shook more than his ever had, and the bouquets were simpler, but she arranged them in that old tin cup and smiled at them the way she'd smiled at Thomas's offerings for 50 years. Adelaide lived another 5 years after Thomas passed, dying peacefully in her sleep at 80. Their children buried her beside Thomas on that ridge, and by the next spring, wildflowers had sprung up over both graves, columbine and Indian paintbrush and wild roses, all the varieties Thomas had picked over the years. The cabin stood for generations after, maintained by their descendants, a testament to two people who had found each other in the wild Colorado mountains and built a love story that became legend. Visitors still came sometimes, wanting to hear the tale of the mountain man who courted his wife with wildflowers every day, the woman who'd brought down a corrupt mining baron, the family they'd raised in the wilderness. But the real story was simpler than the legends. It was about two lonely people who found each other, who chose love daily through small gestures and steady devotion. It was about wildflowers picked fresh each morning and the quiet joy in a woman's eyes when she found them. It was about building a life together, one day at a time, through hardship and triumph and all the ordinary moments in between. Adelaide Klein had never been courted before Thomas Young decided she deserved to be, and once he started, he never stopped, proving that the truest form of love isn't found in grand gestures, but in the consistent, daily choice to honor and cherish another person. Their story lived on in their descendants, in the land they'd stewarded, and in the wildflowers that still bloomed on that mountain ridge faithful as the love that had inspired them, enduring as the mountains themselves. It was a love story for the ages, born in the Wild West, forged in adversity, and sustained by the simplest of rituals. A mountain man who saw a woman no one else had bothered to court and decided she deserved flowers every morning. And a woman strong enough to survive alone, but brave enough to accept love when it was offered with honest hands and a faithful heart. In the end, that was all that mattered. Not the silver claim or the dramatic trial, or even the years of building their homestead. What mattered was the love, steady and sure, expressed in wildflowers and gentle touches, and a lifetime of daily devotion. Thomas and Adelaide Young had lived fully, loved deeply, and left behind a legacy that proved the power of simple, consistent kindness. Their story reminded everyone who heard it that real romance isn't about sweeping gestures or passionate declarations alone, but about showing up every single day, picking wildflowers and choosing love over and over again. And in the mountains they'd both loved so well, where the wind still whispered through the pines, and wildflowers bloomed each spring with faithful regularity. Their spirits lived on two souls who had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful that would never truly die. The end of their mortal story was not an end at all, but a transformation into legend, into inspiration, into proof that love, when tended with care and honored with daily devotion, becomes as eternal as the mountains themselves. Their cabin eventually became a historical site, preserved by their descendants in the state of Colorado as a window into frontier life. But more than that, it stood as a monument to love itself, the real, enduring kind that survives hardship and grows stronger with time. The kind that begins with wildflowers and ends only when the last person who remembers the story finally forgets, which is to say, it never ends at all.